Gas prices soared that Tuesday, do you remember? It seemed like just another price hike. But behind that blinking digital number at your local gas station, there was a Russian tank crossing the Ukrainian border. There was an explosion in Kyiv, a scream caught in a European throat, a world that had just changed, then you didn't even know it yet. It wasn't just about one country invading another. It was about more expensive bread at the bakery, gas that disappeared from German homes, fertilizer that never reached Brazil, wheat that vanished from Egyptian shelves. It was about your wallet, and about the uncomfortable silence of those in charge. The war in Ukraine didn't start with bombs, it started with disinformation, veiled threats, and diplomats sweating in freezing palaces. But when the first missile fell, it hit you, yes, you, even if you didn't hear the boom. You know that rent hike, that grocery purchase that used to cost 80 and now costs 140. The gas that seemed cheap in January became a luxury item in July. All of this has a name, a face, and geopolitics. It has to do with Putin, Zelensky, Biden, and the invisible interests that shape the course of nations. But it also has to do with Maria, who sells sweets to support her children in rural Brazil. With Ahmed, who saw his crops wither due to a lack of fertilizer in Africa. With Helga, an elderly German woman who spent the winter shivering because her heating was cut off. War has maps. But it also has people, and that's where this story begins. The burning question is, how can a war thousands of miles away make rice, fuel, and even your job tremble as if the conflict were inside your home? Why, when a Russian tank advances in Donbass, does your shopping cart recoil? Why, as missiles streak across the Ukrainian sky, do companies on the other side of the world collapse or stock market prices soar? That's what you'll understand now. No filters, no political rhetoric, just the truth, naked, raw, and merciless. Because this isn't just a border war, it's a war that bleeds into your finances. We'll show you what the news doesn't. We'll follow the path of money, political decisions, and real consequences. You'll see that this war isn't just about soldiers, but about markets, commodities, energy, and power. And in the end, the one who pays the bill is you. On the freezing night when the Soviet Union slipped silently out the back door of history, Ukraine awoke, orphaned and dazzled. Kyiv toasted with cheap champagne, promising never to bow its head again, but soon felt the hangover of those who inherit rusty chimneys and empty coffers. The machines that once produced tractors for the entire socialist bloc stopped like frightened hearts. Workers who swore loyalty to the proletariat began selling parts at the market, while oligarchs emerged from the ruins, buying factories at rock-bottom prices. Russia watched from afar. The same pipelines that carried oil and gas now seemed like umbilical cords Moscow could tighten whenever it pleased. Have you ever believed you were free, only to discover someone still held the key to your door? That was Ukraine in the 1990s, independent on paper, dependent on the hand, with a fragile economy ready to be used as a chess piece. A decade later, in a square that would become famous, orange colors lit up winter nights. It wasn't carnival. It was rebellion with the smell of burning wood and raw hope. Thousands demanded fair elections, fearing that the newborn democracy would die suffocated by fraud. Russia supported one side, the European Union winked seductively at the other, and Ukraine split in half, a short blanket that warmed no one completely. The industrial East spoke Russian, the agricultural West spoke Ukrainian, and on every corner, there was someone willing to fight for belonging. When Viktor Yushchenko appeared with his face disfigured by dioxin, the world understood that this was no occasional protest. It was a people screaming for dignity while beneath their feet, gas continued to flow to heat Europe. Those who feel the heating bill rising forget it. Foreign policy becomes a matter of survival. The winter of 2006 brought the sound of empty pipes. Moscow turned the valve, Kyiv screamed, Berlin shuddered. Within days, Polish kitchen flames turned pale blue. Thermometers plummeted in Budapest, and headlines announced the gas war. The fight seemed like pennies in the contract, but it was, in fact, inch by inch of Russian influence. Every cubic meter orbited like a satellite, casting a shadow over investments and agreements. Can you sleep knowing a distant president decides how much heat enters your home? Europe discovered that energy dependence is a dangerous place to be. Ukraine, caught between supplier and customer, realized that being a transit country means wearing a debt-proof vest. Whoever holds the tap dictates the price of fear. Then came 2013, under the cold lights of Independence Square. Students raised the blue and yellow flag, demanding only a treaty with the European Union. It seemed simple: free trade, easy visas, less corruption. But on the board of giants, Simplicity is a mirage. Yanukovych turned his back on Europe at the last minute, accepted a $1 billion loan from Moscow, and let the police rain down their truncheons on protesters. The beatings set tents ablaze, and what had been a demonstration turned into a barricade. Gunfire tore through the queue. Sky mothers sewed homemade vests, and priests prayed among burning tires. As the bodies were laid to rest, Russian troops were already discreetly landing in Crimea as if coming to collect a debt that had never expired. Crimea fell almost without a shot, but with a geopolitical roar that shook post-World War II treaties. A referendum was held under cannons, passports were distributed at the speed of rumors, and the Black Sea became the stage for an imperial return. In the Donbass, masked rebels raised separatist flags, promising Russian protection to those who feared the new government in Kiev. A Buk missile tore through clouds and shot down flight MH17, a reminder that regional conflicts can silence innocence. At an altitude of 10,000 meters, Minsk stitched peace with a fine thread, but the seams burst open, each firework spewing shrapnel that respects no border. Western sanctions, Russian retaliation, investors fleeing, and currencies bleeding. The earthquake was starting to hit your credit card bill. Behind each chapter lies a common denominator: resources. Ukrainian wheat feeds half the world, Russian palladium makes semiconductors, liquefied gas sails to distant ports. When bullets cross these fields, the entire planet feels it. Fertilizer prices soar, automakers postpone launches due to a lack of neon mined in Mariupol, Tunisian bakers protest against empty bags, Brazilian truck drivers complain about inflated diesel prices. War is a stone in the pond. Each wave hits your pocket at different rates. Think it has nothing to do with it. Look at your grocery receipt, the rising electricity bill, unemployment knocking on your neighbor's door. These are whispers of this far-near conflict. The roots aren't left in the past. They tangle in the present and pull the future into uncertain terrain. You woke up early, walked into the grocery store, grabbed the same old package of pasta and froze when you saw the price, almost double what it was a year ago. The label doesn't say bombing, but every extra cent is artillery shrapnel dropped on Ukrainian wheat fields. In March 2022, wheat prices jumped 58%. Since then, even after adjustments, grains and cereals are still more than 12% above pre-war levels. In the icy supermarket aisles, inflation disguises itself as empty shelves. On every shelf, a story of blocked crops, a burned-out silo, a ship stranded in the Black Sea. Ask the baker on the corner why the bread is smaller. He answers with a sigh and without needing to utter the word Donbass. While you're choosing between buying meat or paying the electricity bill, millions are homeless. More than 6.8 million people have crossed borders, and nearly 4 million wander within Ukraine itself, driven by missiles no one sees on news. Imagine fleeing with only a backpack and seeing your rent in Warsaw triple because demand exploded, or living in Kharkiv, losing everything in a drone strike, and still staying because there's nowhere to go. Every refugee who passes through the gates of a crowded station also strains the budgets of those who receive them. Overcrowded daycare centers, hospitals on the brink of collapse, emergency subsidies straining public coffers that were already teetering on the brink of collapse before the war. The biggest bill, however, comes in the form of electricity. In that scorching August of 2022, the TTF contractor gauge of European energy sentiment surpassed €300 per MWh, a record enough to melt any spreadsheet. Restaurants turned off signs to save neon. German factories turned off ovens, sent workers home, and watched Asian rivals snatch orders. Governments rushed to subsidize bills, print money, and fueled the fire of inflation. You feel the effects at the gas station: skyrocketing diesel prices, more expensive freight, layers of costs that pile up until they fall on the end consumer, like dominoes of raw steel and raw gasoline. The IMF did the math and threw a bucket of cold water on it. Global growth, forecast at 4.4%, was downgraded to 3.6%, a sharp 0.8-point cut in the midst of a post-pandemic recovery. Every 10th lost equals thousands of jobs that haven't been created, businesses that haven't opened, and wages that haven't improved. Central banks reacted, with higher interest rates. Credit card debt exploded. Mortgages became unaffordable. The war travels through fiber optic cables, through Wall Street trading floors, and into your bill, multiplying bills before you even hear a single bang. In the distant fields of Brazil or Kenya, the drama is different: a fertilizer shortage. Russia leads global potash exports. With sanctions and blockades, Bags that once cost $300 have now reached $1,000. Soybeans were delayed. Corn shrank, and ranchers sold leaner cattle. The FAO estimates a 10% drop in Ukrainian cereal production in 2024, and the shortage is spreading like an invisible plague across the world's crops. Children in Nairobi trade protein for thin porridge. Brazilian truck drivers calculate freight, already in deficit, and governments ask the IMF for help like someone asking for air in a fire without hoses. What now? You fill your cart, knowing that each item carries a fragment of shrapnel. You swipe your card and feel the war vibrate in the machine. If a missile falls on Odessa tomorrow, how much will the price of your coffee rise? If the gas tap turns off, again, how many jobs will evaporate before the water boils? We're far from the gunfire, but within the economic target. The question isn't whether the conflict will affect your wallet, it's when you'll notice the next impact. And when you hear the next bomb explode, will there be enough credit to cushion this blow? If wheat stops tomorrow, gas prices rise, and ships hesitate to cross the Black Sea, your budget will feel the impact before the evening news. The planet has already tasted the bitter taste. European gas exploded in 2022, exceeding €300 per MWh, and even after retreating, it never returned to its previous cheap price. All it takes is an attack on a port, a closed valve, and the market trembles again. Food followed the same path. The FAO Global Index still reflects a world more expensive than pre-war, with fluctuations that push families to the limit. Energy, food, and freight form a triangle that tightens the wallet. An uncomfortable question: how many consecutive shocks can your salary withstand before breaking? At the beginning of 2025, the TTF hovered around €49 MWh, well above the 27.70 a year earlier, a reminder that the floor has been raised. Projections speak of €34 to 37 per megawatt hours in the summer, still expensive for the industry, because the risk has become a permanent cost embedded in the bill. A long war, without a decisive victory. The front freezes, sanctions become a landscape, and the world learns to live with a conflict on life support. Global growth is stuck near 3%, as the IMF already projects. Inflation is falling but stubbornly eroding wages and delaying investment. Energy prices stabilize at a higher level, forcing factories to automate, migrate, or close. And what about the displaced? Millions remain homeless, putting pressure on host city budgets and exhausted healthcare systems. Normalcy begins to smell of expensive diesel and smaller breads. It's the invisible cost of a visible war. Higher interest rates for longer, stalled planning, tail risks looming over every negotiation. Governments extend subsidies, and the fiscal bill swells. Each winter calls for full inventories and more. LNG Europe could seek over 100 extra cargoes if consumption recovers or supply dwindles. Companies pass on costs, and interest rates are slow to fall. The Black Sea becomes a living game. Drones hit oil depots, Russian missiles batter Odessa, and maritime insurance rates skyrocket. When the war premium rises from 0.5% to 1% or 3% of a ship's value, each voyage increases hundreds of thousands of dollars in price. Higher freight, more expensive food, and life-saving inflation. The grain initiative collapsed in 2023. Since then, alternative corridors have been in place, but under constant strain, and any attack on a dock or bulk carrier pushes rates up. Risk permeates everything. Exporters calculate whether it's worth setting sail, shipowners demand protection, and the premium hits the importer's coffers at the end. Will you accept paying more for bread to keep your ship sailing? Attacks shut down Sochi airport for hours. In Odessa, drones hit civilians and ports. Expanded secondary sanctions. It's not just a ban on sales. It's a punishment for those who buy. If Washington closes the door on Russian fertilizers, Latin American farms which depend heavily on this input will enter emergency mode. Less fertilizer, smaller harvests, more expensive food on the shelves in São Paulo, on the table in Mexico, and in the cart in Miami. International prices are once again shaking. At the same time, Europe, still vulnerable, may need more than 100 additional LNG cargoes to replenish stocks if a harsh winter arrives or supply tightens. It's a chain reaction. Production falls, freight becomes more expensive, governments subsidize, inflation soars, and your salary catches up. Ready for this bill? Brazil buys about a third of its needs from Russia. Mexico imported more than $580 million in fertilizers last year. Without this route, Soybeans and corn are feeling the pinch. Manufacturers warn escalation pushes volatility to new highs and threatens supply chains. Nuclear rhetoric leaves the subtext and returns to the forefront. Since the first months of the invasion, explicit threats have permeated official discourse, reminding the world that Russia maintains a doctrine of tactical use if it deems the state at existential risk. Analysts warn, a demonstrative test, a limited attack, a misinterpretation, and the escalation ladder becomes a waterslide. NATO talks about deterrence and risk control. Experts call for hotlines, protocols, and calibrated messages to avoid miscalculations. Do you sleep soundly knowing that a misinterpreted radar can redefine prices, jobs, and borders in minutes? It's not alarmism, it's prudence. In 2025, the doomsday clock advanced to 89 seconds to midnight, a sign that nuclear risk remains high. In shocks like these, capital flees to safe assets, premiums soar, and energy prices tend to spike, as they did after 22/2. In the end, three paths struggle against each other: diplomacy, a monitored ceasefire, security guarantees, heavy funding for reconstruction, an estimated cost of over $500 billion over the next decade, and reforms that attract investment, prolonged violence, lines under fire, economies draining resources, persistent inflation, and a world addicted to emergencies, and the unthinkable, a nuclear miscalculation, a breakdown of the rules, and decades of delays in hours. To secure the first path, the EU approved a mechanism of up to €50 billion until 2027, and the G7 set up a $50 billion loan backed by profits from frozen Russian assets. Is it enough? Perhaps it's just the down payment, because the bigger bill will fall on your lap if the war continues. The question remains simple: will we push it to tomorrow or demand a viable peace today? The clock is ticking. Every extra cent you pay is a vote for inaction or for a solution. Perhaps the best way to measure a war isn't counting craters, but half-empty shopping carts. The FAO index shows that, in June 2025, food still cost 5.8% more than a year earlier, although it's 20% below the March 2022 peak. A relative relief. That doesn't reach the pockets of those who have already cut back on the superfluous, and are now cutting back on the essential. And there's a new enemy looming in the countryside: extreme weather, droughts, and floods that drive up prices like invisible battalions. Recent studies link climate events to spikes in rice, cocoa, potatoes, and onions. If crops fail and freight prices plummet, what is the limit of a detritan family's resilience? When the books close, who's left out? On the other side of the map, millions still walk with their homes on their backs. As of January 2025, there were approximately 6.8 million registered Ukrainian refugees worldwide, and more than 3.6 million internally displaced people, among a total of 12.7 million people in need of humanitarian assistance. These aren't cold statistics. They're a portrait of lines at shelters, of mothers counting pills, of elderly people choosing between heating their rooms or buying food. And each shelter, each benefit, each adapted school has a real fiscal cost, putting pressure on cities that were already stretched to their limits. How long can solidarity last without a budget? And when the budget is stretched, who will support solidarity? Energy has become a barometer of anxiety. In 2022, European gas prices exploded above €300, MWH, figure that burns like a blowtorch on any spreadsheet. In January 2025, the TTF hovered around €49, MWH, well above the €27.70 a year earlier. Now, at the end of July 2025, it hovers near €32, MWH. Does it seem stable? It's an illusion. All it takes is an attack on a Black Sea port or a pipeline failure for contracts to skyrocket. And when gas prices rise, the furnace shuts down, shifts shorten, unemployment breathes, and inflation reminds us it never went away. How much does it cost for an economy to live under chronic risk? And how much does it cost to pretend it doesn't exist? Growth figures tell the same story, but with a different grammar. The IMF estimated growth at 3.5% in 2022. Falling to 3.0% in 2023 and 2024, with stubborn inflation demanding high interest rates for longer. Early on, the IMF itself predicted war would throw sand in the gears of global recovery, with severe declines in Ukraine, contraction in Russia, and contagion via energy, food, trade, and confidence. If the locomotive loses speed, the cars behind it break free first. Your salary is one of those cars, And if the train slows down again, who will pull you back on track? There are solutions, expensive, difficult, urgent. The European Union set up the Ukraine facility, up to 50 billion euros between 2024 and 2027, attempting to bring predictability to a country that wakes up every day to sirens. The G7, in turn, designed a $50 billion loan backed by profits from frozen Russian assets. In December 2024, the US announced a disbursement of $20 billion within this framework. In Europe, around 210 billion euros of these assets are immobilized. Is it enough? Will it rebuild cities, roads, schools? Or does it just buy time until the next difficult winter? The question isn't rhetorical, it's accounting, political, and moral. Who pays the final bill when the bombs fall silent? We're 89 seconds to midnight, warned doomsday clock scientist, the closest to the abyss in history. And yet it was a grain deal that showed how diplomacy saves lives, when it worked. The UN estimated a drop of over 23% in food prices since March 2022. When Russia withdrew from the pact, prices rose again. Today the FAO records monthly advances and setbacks, a sign that the wound remains raw. So, what have we learned? That peace is cheaper than any subsidy, that energy security is not a luxury, it's a social shield, that hunger in distant ports raises the price of your coffee, and that if we don't demand real solutions, we'll repeat it all again. Will you sleep with this question, or will you take it to the streets?